Lightning split the sky the moment the carriage wheel cracked, and Alara Whitfield was thrown hard against the door as the horses screamed and reared on the narrow bridge. The driver shouted something she could not hear over the storm, and for one long breath she thought the carriage would tip into the black water rushing below. Then the wheel caught, the horses steadied, and the carriage lurched forward onto solid ground, dragging its broken axle with a sound like tearing metal. She sat frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, rain hammering the roof above her. Through the fogged window she saw the shape of a great house rising out of the darkness, its towers barely visible against the storm clouds, its windows dark except for one flickering light on the ground floor. This was Ashcombe Hall. This was the home of the man she had crossed half the country to marry, a duke she had never once laid eyes on. The carriage rolled to a stop before the iron gates, and the driver climbed down, drenched and shaking, to pound on the gatehouse door. Alara pulled her cloak tight and stepped out into the rain herself, unwilling to wait helplessly while a wheel lay broken behind her and the storm worsened by the minute. She was met first not by welcome, but by silence. The gates did not open. A narrow window in the gatehouse cracked open, and a lantern was raised, casting harsh light across her face. A man's voice, rough with suspicion, called out to ask who traveled at such an hour, uninvited, unannounced. Alara straightened her spine, rain plastering her hair to her cheeks, and answered that she was the lady expected at Ashcombe Hall, sent to marry the Duke himself. The lantern did not move for a long moment, as though the man behind it were deciding whether to believe her. Finally the gates groaned open, and a stern-faced man stepped out with an umbrella he did not offer to share. He introduced himself briefly as Edmund Hale, steward of the house, and told her with no warmth at all that his grace was not at Ashcombe. He had left 3 weeks past on urgent business and had sent no word of his return. Alara felt the ground shift beneath her, though this time it was not the storm's doing. She had imagined many things about this journey. She had imagined a nervous first meeting, a formal dinner, perhaps a cold reception from a stranger she was bound to marry by arrangement rather than affection. She had not imagined arriving to an empty house, greeted only by a steward who looked at her the way one might look at an unexpected bill. Edmund led her and the driver through the gates, instructing a stable boy to see to the broken carriage and the frightened horses. He said little else as they crossed the muddy courtyard toward the house, his umbrella tilted just enough to keep the worst of the rain from himself, leaving Alara to walk half-drenched beside him. She noted this without complaint, filing it away as the first small clue to how she might be treated here. The great doors of Ashcombe Hall opened before they reached them, and a woman stood in the frame, holding a lamp high enough to see them both. She was older than Edmund, with silver threading through dark hair pulled into a tight knot, and her eyes moved over Alara with open curiosity rather than suspicion. She introduced herself as Margaret Wren, housekeeper of the house, and there was, at last, something like kindness in her voice as she urged Alara inside out of the storm. The entrance hall was vast and cold, lit only by a handful of candles that threw long shadows up the stone walls. Alara stood dripping on the marble floor, feeling impossibly small beneath the high ceiling, the family portraits staring down at her from the gloom like silent judges. She had expected grandeur. She had not expected it to feel so much like a tomb. Margaret sent a young maid running for dry towels and hot water, all while explaining, in a voice pitched low as though the walls themselves might be listening, that the household had received a letter only 2 days before announcing Alara's arrival, far too little time to prepare a proper welcome. The Duke, she said carefully, had left Ashcombe suddenly, called away on a matter he had shared with no one, not even his own steward. Alara asked as gently as she could when he was expected to return. Margaret's eyes flicked to Edmund before she answered that no one truly knew. It could be days, it could be longer. Alara heard the hesitation in her voice and understood, even in that first hour, that there was more to the Duke's absence than urgent business alone. But she said nothing more of it, not wanting to press strangers for answers on the very night she had arrived, soaked and shaking, into their lives. She was shown to a guest chamber on the 2nd floor, far from the grander room she guessed belonged to the family. The room was clean but sparse, A fire already lit against the cold, and Margaret promised a proper welcome and better quarters once matters were settled. Ilara thanked her, meaning it, grateful for even this small warmth after the chaos of the road. Alone at last, she peeled off her ruined traveling dress and wrapped herself in the blanket left folded at the foot of the bed, sitting by the fire as the storm continued to batter the windows. She thought of her family back home, of the arrangement that had brought her here, a match made for reasons of land and alliance rather than love. She had accepted it without complaint, as young women in her position were expected to. But she had never imagined the man she was meant to marry would be a stranger even to his own house on the night she arrived. Sleep did not come easily. She lay listening to the storm and to the strange sounds of an unfamiliar house settling around her, footsteps in distant corridors, a door closing somewhere below, the low murmur of voices she could not place. Once she thought she heard someone stop outside her door, though when she rose to check, the corridor beyond was empty and dark. Morning arrived gray and quiet, the storm finally spent, leaving the grounds of Ashcombe Hall glistening with rain. Ilara rose early, unwilling to lie abed in a house full of strangers who already seemed unsure what to make of her. She dressed in the simplest gown she had brought, wanting to appear neither grand nor demanding on her first true day in this place, and made her way down the wide staircase toward the sounds of the household waking. She found the kitchens by following the smell of bread, and there she met more of the staff than she had the night before, a cook named Bessie who eyed her with open astonishment, and two young maids who curtsied so quickly they nearly dropped the trays in their hands. None of them seemed to know quite how to behave around her, a lady meant to be their future mistress, arriving without her intended husband present to introduce her properly. Ilara did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. She offered to help. Bessie laughed at first, certain the lady was joking, but when Ilara reached for an apron hanging by the door and asked what needed doing, the laughter faded into something closer to surprise. She was given simple tasks, sorting fruit for preserves, nothing that required skill, but it was enough to break the ice a little, enough for the maids to begin speaking more freely around her instead of falling silent whenever she entered a room. By mid-morning, word of her small kindness had clearly spread through the house, because when she crossed paths with Edmund again in the long gallery, his manner toward her had shifted, not warm, but no longer quite so guarded either. He informed her, with something almost like respect, that his Grace's return remained uncertain, but that the household would see to her comfort in the meantime. Ilara thanked him and asked, carefully, whether she might be permitted to see more of the house and grounds, rather than remaining confined to her chamber and the public rooms. He hesitated at that, just long enough for her to notice, before agreeing that Margaret could show her the parts of the house considered appropriate. There was a particular emphasis on the word appropriate that caught in Ilara's mind, a small flag raised in the back of her thoughts. She wondered, not for the first time since arriving, what exactly was being kept from her, and why a house meant to become her home already felt full of locked doors and lowered voices. That afternoon, Margaret walked her through the public wings of Ashcombe Hall, the long portrait gallery lined with generations of the Duke's ancestors, the grand dining hall large enough to seat 60 guests though clearly unused in some time, the library with its towering shelves and dust-softened silence. Ilara asked questions as they walked, gentle ones at first, about the family, about the Duke himself, about the history of the house. Margaret answered most of them readily enough, clearly proud of Ashcombe Hall despite its current quiet, but certain questions made her pause, her answers growing careful and clipped. When Ilara asked about the West Wing, visible from the gardens but strangely absent from their tour, Margaret's expression changed entirely. She said only that the West Wing had been closed for some years now, and that it was not considered part of the house any longer. She offered no further explanation, and something in her tone made it clear that pressing further would not be welcomed. Ilara let the matter drop, though she filed it away alongside the other small mysteries gathering around her since her arrival. As the day wore on, Ilara found herself drawn again and again to the household staff rather than the empty grandeur of the house itself. She helped fold linens with two maids named Alice and Nora, who giggled nervously at first, but soon began chattering about the house, about the neighboring village, about the Duke's coming and going in ways that told Alara more than any formal introduction could have. She learned that the Duke was known among the staff as fair but distant, a man who worked harder than any lord needed to, and who had grown quieter, they said, since a loss in the family some years back, though none of them would say plainly what that loss had been. By evening, Alara understood two things clearly. First, that the household of Ashcombe Hall was not simply cautious of a stranger arriving to marry their master, but genuinely uncertain of their own footing, as though something beneath the surface of the house had been unsettled long before she ever arrived. Second, that she would learn far more about the man she was meant to marry from his servants than she ever would from an empty house and a stack of unanswered letters. She ate dinner alone that night in a small parlor rather than the great dining hall, a kindness suggested by Margaret, who seemed to sense that the vast empty table would only remind Alara of how alone she truly was in this new place. As she finished her meal, Edmund appeared at the parlor door, informing her that a letter had arrived that afternoon, addressed to the household rather than to her directly, confirming that his Grace remained occupied and unable to say when he would return. Alara asked, as steadily as she could manage, whether the letter mentioned any details of the business keeping him away. Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he answered that it did not, only that matters required his continued attention. She thanked him for informing her, and he left without further comment, though she noticed, just before he turned, a flicker of something troubled cross his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Alone again, Alara sat by the parlor fire long after her meal was finished, turning over everything she had learned in a single day. A house with a closed wing no one would speak of. A duke absent on business no one could explain. A household caught between welcoming her and guarding secrets she had not yet earned the right to know. She had come to Ashcombe Hall expecting a marriage of convenience to a stranger. She had not expected to find herself standing at the edge of a mystery the very night she arrived, with every person in the house watching her just as carefully as she was watching them. Outside, the last of the storm clouds cleared, revealing a sky full of stars over the dark shape of the west wing, its windows black and silent against the night. Alara watched it from her window for a long while before finally retiring to bed, aware, even without knowing why, that whatever waited behind those shuttered windows would not stay hidden from her for long. And somewhere beyond the estate, on a road she could not see, the man she was meant to marry rode through the night toward a trouble of his own, one that would soon collide with everything now taking root inside the walls of his ancestral home. 3 days passed at Ashcombe Hall before Alara truly began to understand the shape of the house she had entered. It was not simply large, it was layered, full of rules unspoken but firmly enforced, boundaries drawn not by walls alone but by the careful silence of everyone who lived within them. She learned these boundaries slowly, the way one learns the currents of an unfamiliar river, by watching where others refused to swim. The west wing remained the clearest of these boundaries. Each morning, from the window of her chamber, she could see its shuttered windows catching the pale light, and each morning she resisted the urge to ask more questions about it, sensing that pressing too hard too soon would only close doors that might otherwise open on their own. Instead, she turned her attention to the parts of the house that welcomed her, and to the people who, day by day, seemed less wary of her presence. Margaret Wren became, in those early days, something close to a guide through the unfamiliar customs of the house. She explained the rhythms of the staff, who rose before dawn to light the fires, who managed the accounts, who oversaw the gardens that stretched behind the house in neat, disciplined rows despite the absence of any family to enjoy them. Alara listened carefully to all of it, understanding that knowledge of a house was its own kind of power, and that a stranger who understood nothing would remain a stranger far longer than one who made the effort to learn. It was during one of these mornings, walking the kitchen garden with Margaret, that Alara first heard the name spoken aloud that no one else had dared mention. Margaret was explaining the layout of the herb beds when a younger gardener, a boy no older than 14, mentioned in passing that the roses near the old fountain had once belonged to Master Julian, before falling suddenly silent, as though he had said something forbidden. Margaret's expression tightened, and she quickly steered the conversation elsewhere, but Alara had already caught the name, and she held on to it like a thread she intended to follow. She did not ask about it directly that day, sensing that Margaret would deflect just as she had before. Instead, she waited until later that evening, when she found herself alone with Alice in the linen room, folding sheets by candlelight while the rest of the house settled into quiet. Alice was younger than the other staff, less careful with her words, and Alara had noticed that a little warmth and patience went a long way with her. She asked gently who Julian had been. Alice's hands stilled over the linen for a moment, and she glanced toward the door before answering in a low voice that Julian had been the Duke's younger brother, and that he had died 3 years past, before Alice herself had come to work at Ashcombe Hall. She said no one spoke of it, not because they had been forbidden exactly, but because grief in that house had settled so deep that even mentioning his name felt like disturbing something better left undisturbed. Alara asked carefully how he had died, and Alice hesitated long enough that Alara nearly withdrew the question. But then Alice answered that it had happened at the house itself, in the West Wing, though she did not know the details, only that the Duke had changed after it, becoming quieter, more distant, more consumed by work than any lord she had ever heard of. She said the West Wing had been closed the same season, and had remained closed ever since, its rooms left exactly as they were, untouched by staff or family alike. The information settled over Alara like a weight she had not expected to carry. She thanked Alice for her honesty, and the girl, seeming to realize she had said more than intended, asked nervously that Alara not mention where she had heard it. Alara promised, meaning it fully, understanding already that trust in this house was a fragile thing, built in small increments and easily shattered by carelessness. That night, unable to sleep, Alara found herself standing at her window once more, looking out at the dark shape of the West Wing against the moonlit grounds. She thought of the Duke she had not yet met, a man carrying grief heavy enough to close an entire section of his own home, a man who had left suddenly on business no one could explain, only weeks before a bride he had never seen was set to arrive. She wondered whether his absence was truly about business at all, or whether it was something closer to the same instinct that kept every servant in this house from speaking his brother's name. The following days brought a shift in the household's treatment of her, subtle but unmistakable. Where once the staff had watched her with wary politeness, they began instead to include her, almost without meaning to, in the small tasks and conversations that made up daily life at Ashcombe Hall. Bessie taught her to bake bread the way the kitchen had always made it, laughing when Alara's first attempt came out heavier than a brick. Nora showed her the fastest route through the servants' passages, insisting it would save her time navigating the enormous house. Even Edmund, though never warm, began greeting her each morning with something approaching respect rather than mere formality. Alara understood that this shift had not come from her title or her position as the future mistress of the house. It had come, instead, from her willingness to fold linens and sort fruit and listen to servants speak of things they cared about, rather than demanding the deference her rank might have entitled her to. She had not planned this approach as strategy, only as instinct, a way of surviving the loneliness of arriving somewhere entirely unknown. But she began to notice its effect nonetheless, and she resolved to continue it, not out of calculation, but because it felt simply like the right way to live in a house full of strangers who might one day become something closer to family. It was nearly a week after her arrival when the first real crisis struck, small in the scope of the wider world, but significant enough within the walls of Ashcombe Hall to reveal exactly what kind of woman Alara truly was. It began in the early hours of the morning, long before the household typically stirred, with the sound of shouting from the direction of the kitchens. Alara woke instantly, some instinct honed by years of managing her own family's smaller household telling her that shouting before dawn meant trouble rather than mere noise. She dressed quickly and made her way down through the dark corridors, following the commotion until she reached the kitchen, where she found chaos already unfolding. A fire had broken out near the ovens, likely from embers left too close to a stack of kindling, and flames were licking dangerously close to the wooden shelves lining the walls, shelves stocked with the household's winter stores. Bessie stood frozen, a bucket in her hands, clearly overwhelmed by the speed of the flames, while Nora ran back and forth uselessly, unsure whether to fetch water or wake the rest of the house. Ilara did not hesitate. She took command of the moment with a calm that surprised even herself, directing Nora to fetch more buckets from the well outside, while she herself grabbed heavy cloths to smother the flames closest to the shelves before they could spread further. Within minutes, more of the staff arrived, drawn by the noise, and Ilara organized them quickly into a line, passing buckets hand to hand from the well outside to the kitchen within, while she and Bessie worked together to beat back the flames directly. It was hard, smoke-filled work, and more than once Ilara felt her eyes burn and her lungs protest. But she did not stop, driven by the simple understanding that this house, however unfamiliar, held people who depended on these stores surviving the winter ahead. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, the kitchen was a ruin of scorched wood and soaked ash. But the worst of the damage had been contained to a single wall, sparing the bulk of the winter stores and, more importantly, ensuring no one had been seriously harmed. Ilara stood amid the wreckage, her dress ruined, her hair falling loose from its pins, soot streaked across her face, and looked around at the household staring back at her with something entirely new in their eyes. Edmund arrived late to the scene, having been roused from a distant part of the house, and he took in the sight before him with visible astonishment. The future Duchess of Ashcombe Hall standing in a ruined kitchen covered in ash, having clearly led the effort to save it rather than waiting for someone else to manage the crisis on her behalf. He said nothing for a long moment, simply looking at her, and then, quietly, he thanked her, in a tone far removed from the guarded formality he had shown her since her arrival. Margaret, arriving shortly after, immediately began organizing the cleanup, but not before pulling Ilara aside to examine a small burn on her hand, tending to it herself with a gentleness that spoke louder than any words could have. As she wrapped the burn in clean linen, she told Ilara, in a voice thick with something like emotion, that no lady of the house had ever done what she had just done, and that the staff would not soon forget it. Word of the fire, and of Ilara's role in fighting it, spread through the household within hours, carried from the kitchens to the stables to the gardens by servants eager to share what they had witnessed. By midday, Ilara found herself greeted not with wary politeness, but with genuine warmth wherever she went, the staff no longer treating her as a stranger imposed upon their household, but as someone who had proven, in the most immediate way possible, that she belonged among them. Even the boy from the garden, the one who had let slip the name Julian days before, approached her that afternoon, shy but earnest, offering her a small bundle of herbs from the kitchen garden as thanks, saying only that his mother worked in the kitchens and had told him what Ilara had done. Ilara accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, understanding that in a house built on careful silence and guarded grief, this small gesture of trust meant more than any formal welcome ever could have. That evening, as she sat once more in the small parlor Margaret had claimed for her private use, Ilara reflected on how quickly everything had changed in a single week. She had arrived at Ashcombe Hall a stranger, greeted by locked gates and suspicious eyes, uncertain whether she would ever feel at home in a house so clearly shaped by loss and silence. Now, only days later, she found herself woven into its daily rhythms, trusted by its staff, drawn ever closer to the mysteries still hidden within its walls. She thought again of the West Wing, its shuttered windows dark against the night sky, and of the brother whose name still could not be spoken aloud without care. She thought of the Duke himself, still absent, still unknown to her except through the fragments others offered without meaning to. And she understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her chest, that whatever waited for her at the end of this strange beginning, she would face it not as an outsider forced into a stranger's home, but as someone who had already begun, in ways she had not fully intended, to make Ashcombe Hall her own. Outside her window, the last light of evening faded over the grounds, and somewhere beyond the horizon, on a road growing shorter with each passing day, the The Duke of Ashcombe Hall continued toward a reckoning of his own, unaware that the house he had left behind, and the stranger he had sent for, had already begun to change into something he would not recognize when at last he returned. 2 weeks into her stay at Ashcombe Hall, Alara had learned enough of the house and its people to fill a private notebook she kept locked in her chamber, though she had written nothing down herself, trusting instead to memory the small details she gathered each day. She knew now which floorboards creaked in the east corridor, which maid preferred to be called by her full name rather than a shortened one, and which topics could be raised in casual conversation, and which required careful patience before anyone would speak of them at all. The fire in the kitchen had changed something fundamental in how the household regarded her, but it had not, she realized, opened every door. The West Wing remained closed, its secrets guarded as carefully as ever, and though the staff now greeted her warmly and included her in their daily work, there remained a line beyond which even the friendliest among them would not cross, not out of distrust of her specifically, but out of a loyalty to something larger than either of them, a loyalty to the family that had employed them for years before she ever arrived. It was Margaret who finally began to bridge that gap, though not all at once, and not through any single conversation. Rather, it happened gradually, over shared cups of tea in the housekeeper's small sitting room, over long afternoons spent inventorying linens and discussing the household accounts, tasks Alara had begun helping with simply because she found the empty hours of waiting for the Duke's return unbearable without purpose. Margaret, seeing her genuine interest in the running of the house rather than mere idle curiosity, began, slowly, to trust her with more. It was during one such afternoon, as autumn rain tapped gently against the sitting room windows, that Margaret finally spoke of Julian at length, without Alara having to ask. She had been organizing old ledgers, and her fingers had paused over an entry dated 3 years past, her expression softening into something like old sorrow before she looked up and asked Alara, quite suddenly, whether she had heard the name already from someone in the house. Alara considered lying, considered protecting Alice from any consequence of having spoken too freely, but something in Margaret's tired, open expression convinced her that honesty would serve them both better than caution. She admitted that she had heard the name, though not the full story, and that she had chosen not to press for details out of respect for a grief that clearly still weighed on the household. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the ledger in her hands, before she finally began to speak. Julian, she explained, had been the Duke's younger brother by 4 years, a warm and reckless young man who had filled Ashcombe Hall with a kind of life it had not known before or since. Where the Duke, whom Margaret referred to simply as his grace out of long habit, had always been serious and dutiful, burdened early by responsibility after their father's death, Julian had been the opposite, quick to laugh, quick to take risks, beloved by every member of the staff for his easy warmth and his complete lack of the formality expected of his rank. It was that recklessness, Margaret said quietly, that had ultimately taken him. She did not go into great detail, only that there had been an accident in the West Wing, late one night, involving a fall from the upper gallery that ran along the wing's grand staircase, a fall that no one had witnessed and few had ever fully explained. Julian had been alone at the time, having sent the household to bed early, and by the time his absence was noticed the following morning, it was already far too late. The Duke, Margaret said, had been away himself that night, attending to business in the capital, and had returned to find his household in mourning and his brother already laid to rest in the family chapel, the funeral arranged in haste by relatives eager to spare the Duke the sight of his brother's body before he could return. Margaret's voice caught slightly as she described how the Duke had walked the halls of Ashcombe Hall for weeks afterward like a man only half present, until finally, one morning, he had ordered the West Wing sealed entirely, its doors locked, its rooms left untouched, and had never spoken his brother's name aloud again in Margaret's hearing. Alara listened to all of this in silence, understanding now, with far greater clarity, the shape of the grief that hung over Ashcombe Hall like a permanent fog. She understood, too, why the Duke's absence upon her own arrival had troubled the household so deeply, not simply as a breach of courtesy toward his intended bride, but as an echo of another absence, another departure that had ended in tragedy the household had never fully recovered from. She asked gently whether the accident had ever been fully investigated, whether anyone had ever determined exactly what had happened that night. Margaret's expression shifted at the question, something guarded returning to her eyes, and she admitted after a pause that there had been questions at the time, whispers among the staff that something about the accident did not sit right, that Julian had known that gallery since childhood and was not a man to stumble carelessly over a railing he had crossed 1,000 times before. But the questions, she said, had been quietly discouraged, first by grieving relatives eager to close the matter, and later by the Duke himself, who seemed unable to bear any further discussion of the night that had taken his brother from him. Alara turned the information over carefully in her mind long after the conversation ended, sensing that there was more beneath the surface than even Margaret, in her honesty, had been willing or able to share. She did not press further that day, understanding that Margaret had already given her a great gift in trusting her with the truth at all, and that pushing for more too quickly might undo the fragile confidence being built between them. Instead, she turned her attention, in the days that followed, to smaller observations, pieces of the household's daily life that might, taken together, form a clearer picture of what had truly happened 3 years past. She noticed, for instance, that the groundskeeper, an older man named Silas who tended the gardens with quiet devotion, avoided the west wing entirely, even when his work required him to trim the hedges along its outer walls, always finding some excuse to leave that particular task to a younger hand. She noticed, too, that Edmund kept a specific set of keys separate from the rest of the household ring, keys he alone carried, and that his manner grew notably tense whenever anyone so much as glanced toward the locked doors of the west wing. It was nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, during a quiet evening when most of the household had already retired, that Alara finally found herself standing before those very doors, drawn there not entirely by conscious decision, but by a restlessness she could not fully explain. She had told herself she was simply taking a late walk through the house, unable to sleep, but she knew, even as her feet carried her down the west corridor, that some part of her had been waiting for a moment exactly like this one. The doors themselves were heavy oak, bound with iron, locked as Margaret had described, showing no obvious sign of disturbance despite 3 years of neglect. Alara stood before them for a long while, one hand resting against the cool wood, feeling, absurdly, as though she were standing at the edge of something far larger than a simple locked room. She thought of Julian, a young man she had never met, beloved and reckless, gone from this world in a single fall no one had witnessed. She thought of the Duke, carrying that loss through every silent hour of his absence, perhaps even now, wherever his urgent business had taken him, still haunted by the same unanswered questions that lingered in his own household. She did not attempt to open the doors that night, understanding that whatever lay behind them was not hers to uncover through force or trespass. Not yet, not without more understanding of the family she had entered and more trust from the people who protected its secrets so carefully. Instead, she simply stood there a while longer, offering, in her own quiet way, a kind of respect to the grief the house still carried, before finally turning back toward her own chamber and the sleep that had eluded her all evening. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Ashcombe Hall, the first since Alara's own arrival, and the household's reaction to the news told her immediately that this was no ordinary guest. A carriage arrived shortly after breakfast, its crest unfamiliar to Alara but clearly recognized at once by the staff, who scattered into a flurry of nervous preparation the moment word reached the kitchens. Margaret appeared at Alara's door within minutes, her expression tight with something Alara had not yet seen from her, a mixture of duty and unmistakable dread. The visitor, Margaret explained hurriedly as she helped Alara into a more formal gown, was Lady Constance Vane, a distant cousin of the Duke's late father, and a woman who had visited Ashcombe Hall only rarely in years past. Always, Margaret noted carefully, at moments when the family was at its most vulnerable. She had come, apparently, upon hearing news of the Duke's absence and the arrival of his intended bride, though how she had heard so quickly remained unclear to anyone in the household. Alara descended to the entrance hall to find a tall, elegant woman already waiting, dressed in dark, expensive fabrics that spoke of both wealth and a certain theatrical severity, her eyes sweeping over Alara with an assessment so open it bordered on rude. Lady Constance introduced herself with practiced courtesy, expressing surprise, in a tone that did not sound surprised at all, that the Duke had left his intended bride to fend for herself in his absence, as though this were a scandal she had come specifically to witness and later discuss. Alara greeted her with careful politeness, offering refreshment and a tour of the house, determined not to give this unexpected guest any sign of the unease her arrival had clearly caused among the staff. Lady Constance accepted, though her sharp eyes continued to catalogue everything around her: the state of the gardens, the condition of the furnishings, the visible absence of the Duke himself, with the air of someone building a case rather than simply making conversation. It was over tea in the drawing room, with Margaret hovering nearby under the pretense of attending to the refreshments, that Lady Constance finally revealed something of her true purpose. She spoke with careful casualness of the estate's finances, of debts she claimed the Duke had inherited alongside his title, debts that had only grown heavier in the years since Julian's death, and of her own concern, as a family elder, that the Duke's sudden and unexplained absence might signal troubles far greater than mere business. Alara listened carefully, saying little, aware that Lady Constance seemed to be testing her, gauging how much she knew and how much she might be persuaded to doubt. When Lady Constance suggested, with feigned sympathy, that perhaps Alara's family had been misled about the true state of the Duke's fortune before agreeing to the match, Alara answered simply that her family's arrangement had been made with full knowledge and full trust in the Duke's character, and that she saw no reason to doubt either now, whatever difficulties his absence might currently present. Lady Constance's expression flickered, just briefly, with something like irritation at finding her probing met with such calm resistance, before she smoothed it over with another practiced smile and changed the subject entirely, asking instead about Alara's family and her life before coming to Ashcombe Hall. The conversation continued for another hour, pleasant on its surface, but Alara left it with a clear sense that Lady Constance had come not out of concern for her cousin's household, but for reasons entirely her own, reasons that had little to do with Alara's welfare, and everything to do with whatever advantage she hoped to gain from a Duke who was, for the moment, conveniently absent. That evening, once Lady Constance had finally departed after declining, to the household's evident relief, an invitation to stay the night, Alara found Margaret in the kitchens and asked, directly, what she knew of Lady Constance's history with the family. Margaret's answer was careful but unmistakably wary. Lady Constance, she explained, had long resented her own branch of the family's exclusion from the main line of inheritance, and had, in the past, made more than one attempt to insert herself into the estate's affairs, always under the guise of concern, always retreating the moment the Duke himself returned to assert his authority. Alara absorbed this information with growing unease, understanding now that Ashcombe Hall harbored not only the quiet grief of a lost brother, but the active, calculating interest of relatives who might see the Duke's prolonged absence as opportunity rather than misfortune. She thought of the closed West Wing, of the unanswered questions surrounding Julian's death, of Lady Constance's pointed questions about the estate's finances, and felt, for the first time since her arrival, a genuine current of danger running beneath the household's careful routines. She resolved that night to pay closer attention not only to the mysteries of the past, but to whatever might still be unfolding in the present, understanding that whatever waited for the Duke upon his eventual return, she herself now stood, whether she had intended it or not, directly in the path of it. In the days following Lady Constance's visit, Alara found herself watching the household with new eyes, aware now that the quiet grief settled over Ashcombe Hall was not the only force shaping its fate. She began paying closer attention to the estate's daily business, asking Edmund small questions about the running of the tenant farms, the collection of rents, the state of the accounts he managed on the Duke's behalf. He answered her cautiously at first, clearly unused to a lady taking such direct interest in matters usually left to men of business, but her persistence, gentle and genuine rather than demanding, gradually won a measure of his confidence as well. It was Edmund who first mentioned, almost in passing, that the Duke had left behind a small study on the ground floor where he conducted the estate's correspondence, a room that had remained untouched since his departure, except for the necessary business Edmund himself continued to manage. Alara asked carefully whether she might be permitted to see it, explaining honestly that she hoped to better understand the estate she would one day help oversee. Edmund hesitated, weighing the request against whatever instructions he had been left before finally agreeing, on the condition that she disturb nothing without his knowledge. The study, when she entered it the following afternoon, was smaller than she expected, practical rather than grand, its walls lined with ledgers and correspondence rather than the ornamental trappings found elsewhere in the house. It smelled faintly of ink and old paper, and standing in it, Alara felt closer to the Duke than she had at any point since her arrival, surrounded by the physical evidence of a man who clearly worked harder than his title required. Edmund showed her the estate's basic accounts, patiently explaining the sources of income from the tenant farms, the expenses of maintaining a house as large as Ashcombe Hall, the modest but steady profits that had, until recent years, kept the family comfortably secure. It was when he reached the more recent ledgers, however, that his explanations grew noticeably more careful, his finger tracing entries he seemed reluctant to elaborate on fully. Alara studied the figures herself, and even with her limited experience in matters of estate finance, she could see plainly enough that something had shifted in the years since Julian's death. Expenses had grown steadily, certain accounts had been drawn down more heavily than seemed sustainable, and there were entries, vague and unexplained, describing payments made to parties whose names meant nothing to her. When she asked Edmund directly what these payments represented, his expression grew guarded in a way she had not seen from him since her earliest days at the house. He answered, after a long pause, that some of the estate's difficulties stemmed from debts Julian had accumulated before his death, debts the Duke had quietly assumed responsibility for rather than allow his brother's memory to be tarnished by scandal. Alara absorbed this with a growing sense that the picture of Ashcombe Hall's troubles was more complicated than even Lady Constance's pointed questions had suggested. A private sacrifice made by a grieving man determined to protect a brother's reputation even after death. But there was something else in Edmund's tone, a hesitation that suggested even this explanation was incomplete. When she pressed gently, asking whether the debts alone accounted for the estate's current strain, he admitted, reluctantly, that certain other payments had begun more recently. In just the past year, payments he himself did not fully understand, arranged directly by the Duke without explanation, and drawn from accounts that were growing thinner with each passing month. Alara turned this new information over carefully in her mind as she left the study that evening. A grieving Duke, protecting his brother's memory through quiet debt. Recent, unexplained payments draining the estate further still. A cousin who had arrived within days of the Duke's own sudden departure, asking pointed questions about the family's finances with an interest that seemed far too eager to be simple concern. The pieces did not yet form a complete picture, but she felt, with growing certainty, that they were connected in ways she had not yet fully understood. It was 2 days later, while helping Margaret sort through correspondence that had accumulated during the Duke's absence, that Alara found the first true clue linking these separate threads together. Among letters concerning routine estate business, one envelope stood apart, its handling clearly deliberate, tucked at the bottom of a drawer Margaret opened only to retrieve a spare key. It was addressed to the Duke in handwriting Alara did not recognize, though something about its formal, careful script struck her as familiar in a way she could not immediately place. Margaret, noticing her interest, explained that the letter had arrived shortly before the Duke's departure, and that he had read it alone in his study before emerging, pale and tense, to announce his sudden business away from Ashcombe Hall. She had assumed at the time that it concerned some private family matter, but she had never learned its contents, and the Duke had left it locked away rather than taking it with him, an oversight she had noticed only when clearing the drawer for household use. Alara asked carefully whether it would be improper to read a letter left unsealed and clearly abandoned in a drawer no longer in private use. Margaret hesitated, torn between loyalty to her absent master and a growing trust in the woman who would, in time, become mistress of this very house. Finally, she nodded, agreeing that whatever the letter contained, Alara had as much right as anyone to understand what had driven the Duke so suddenly from his own home. The letter, when Alara finally opened it, was brief but unmistakably threatening in tone, though carefully worded to avoid any outright accusation that could be proven. It referenced, in veiled language, certain facts concerning the night of Julian's death, facts the writer claimed to possess and was prepared to make public unless the Duke agreed to certain unspecified terms. It was signed only with an initial, a single elegant letter that told Alara nothing directly, but which struck her, studying the careful, formal penmanship once more, as achingly similar to the handwriting she had glimpsed on a note Lady Constance had left behind after her visit, thanking the household for its hospitality in the same elegant, deliberate script. She said nothing of this suspicion to Margaret immediately, wanting to be certain before voicing an accusation that could unravel whatever fragile trust still held the household together. But the implications settled over her with cold clarity nonetheless. If Lady Constance, or someone connected to her, had sent this letter, then the Duke's sudden departure had not been business at all, not in any ordinary sense. He had been summoned, or threatened, into leaving his own household at precisely the moment his family's oldest, most painful secret might be exposed, and precisely the moment a stranger, his own intended bride, was set to arrive and discover a house already destabilized by grief and financial strain. Alara spent that night awake long past the hour when the rest of the household had retired, turning the letter over in her hands by candlelight, reading its careful, threatening language again and again, until she nearly had it memorized. She thought of Julian's fall from the gallery, of the whispers Margaret had described among staff who found the accident difficult to accept at face value. She thought of Lady Constance's pointed questions about the estate's finances, questions that now seemed less like idle curiosity, and more like the careful probing of someone already aware of vulnerabilities she intended to exploit. If someone had truly held knowledge, or even mere suspicion, about the true circumstances of Julian's death, and had used that knowledge to draw the Duke away from his own household at this precise, vulnerable moment, then the danger facing Ashcombe Hall was far greater than Alara had understood even after learning of its grief and its debts. It was not simply a house haunted by an old tragedy. It was a house actively under threat, its master lured away by forces still working, even now, to unravel whatever remained of its stability. She resolved, in the quiet hours before dawn finally broke over the estate, that she could not simply wait passively for the Duke's return while these forces continued to work unchecked. She would need to understand more, to gather whatever evidence she could, to prepare the household as best she could for whatever confrontation might eventually come, whether it arrived with the Duke's return or before it. She thought of the locked doors of the West Wing, of the answers that might still wait behind them, and understood with growing resolve that the time for careful patience alone had passed. The following morning she sought out Edmund once more, and this time, rather than asking careful, indirect questions, she spoke to him plainly, showing him the letter she had found and explaining her suspicions about its author. Edmund read it in silence, his expression darkening with each line, and when he finally looked up, the guarded distance that had defined so much of their earlier interactions had entirely vanished, replaced by something like grim partnership. He admitted quietly that he too had long harbored doubts about the official account of Julian's death, doubts he had never voiced aloud out of respect for the Duke's grief, and a fear of disturbing a peace, however fragile, that the household had built around its silence. but faced now with clear evidence that someone had used that very tragedy as leverage against the Duke himself. He agreed that silence was no longer a service to anyone, least of all to the family he had spent his life serving. Together, they resolved to learn what they could, carefully and quietly, before the Duke's return. Edmund would review the estate's correspondence more thoroughly, searching for any further trace of the threats that had driven his master away. Alara, for her part, found her thoughts returning again and again to the locked doors of the West Wing, and to the answers she suspected still waited within, patient and undisturbed, for someone finally willing to seek them out. The decision to enter the West Wing was not one Alara made lightly, and she did not make it alone. She spoke first with Edmund, and then carefully with Margaret, explaining that whatever grief the closed rooms represented, the household could no longer afford the luxury of leaving them undisturbed while unknown threats worked against the family from the shadows. Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the suggestion, old sorrow rising to the surface, but she did not refuse. Instead, she retrieved, from a small box hidden at the back of her own wardrobe, a second set of keys to the West Wing, kept in secret for 3 years against exactly the kind of necessity she had hoped would never arise. They chose to go at night, when the rest of the household slept, wanting to avoid the questions and fear that daylight discovery might spread among the staff before Alara and Edmund fully understood what, if anything, they hoped to find. Margaret insisted on joining them, unwilling to let either face the wing's silent rooms alone, and the three of them made their way through the sleeping house with lanterns shielded and voices lowered, feeling, despite the innocence of their purpose, like trespassers in their own home. The doors opened with a groan of hinges long unused, releasing a breath of stale, undisturbed air that spoke of 3 years without a single visitor. The rooms beyond were exactly as Margaret had described, frozen in time, furniture draped in white cloth. A fine layer of dust settled over everything untouched since the household had sealed the wing in the depths of its grief. Alara felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the abandoned rooms. They moved slowly through the wing, Edmund leading the way with his lantern raised, until they reached the grand staircase Margaret had described, its gallery railing still intact, showing no obvious sign of the tragedy that had unfolded there 3 years before. Alara studied the railing carefully, running her hand along its smooth wood, trying to imagine the moment Julian had fallen, searching for anything that might confirm or deny the official account the family had settled on so long ago. It was Edmund who noticed it first, crouching near the base of the staircase where the gallery met the floor below, his lantern illuminating a small, dark stain long since faded into the wood grain, easily missed by anyone not specifically searching for it. Beside it, wedged into a gap between 2 floorboards, something small and metallic caught the lantern light. Edmund reached down carefully and retrieved it, holding it up for Alara and Margaret to see. It was a cufflink, elegant and clearly expensive, engraved with initials that were not Julian's own. Margaret gasped softly, recognizing the craftsmanship immediately as belonging to a jeweler who served only the wealthiest families in the region, and Alara, turning the small object over in her palm, felt the final piece of a puzzle she had been assembling for weeks click quietly into place. The initials engraved upon it were the same as those signed at the bottom of the threatening letter she had found in the Duke's study. The implications settled over the 3 of them in heavy silence. If this cufflink belonged to the same person who had later threatened the Duke over the circumstances of Julian's death, then that person had not simply learned of the tragedy after the fact. They had been present here in this very gallery on the night Julian died, and had left behind, in their haste or carelessness, physical proof of a presence the official account had never acknowledged. Alara asked Margaret carefully whether Lady Constance had ever been known to wear cufflinks of this particular style, understanding even as she asked that the question sounded strange for a woman's ornament. Margaret's expression shifted with sudden understanding, and she explained, her voice barely above a whisper, that Lady Constance's late husband had been known for exactly this kind of jewelry, and that since his death, Lady Constance herself had taken to wearing several of his finer pieces as her own, a habit some in the household had considered eccentric rather than sinister. The picture forming in Alara's mind now was darker and more dangerous than she had allowed herself to fully imagine even after finding the threatening letter. If Lady Constance, or someone acting on her behalf, had been present in the West Wing the night Julian died, if she had left this cufflink behind in the aftermath of whatever had truly occurred, and if she had later used knowledge of that night to threaten the Duke into leaving his own household undefended, then the danger facing Ashcombe Hall was not merely financial or reputational. It was something far more serious, something that had already, perhaps, cost one member of this family his life. They left the West Wing before dawn, resealing its doors carefully behind them, agreeing among themselves to say nothing to the wider household until they understood more fully what they now faced. But the discovery changed everything for Alara. She no longer saw her time at Ashcombe Hall as simply a period of waiting for a stranger's return, or even as a slow process of earning a household's trust. She understood now that she stood at the edge of something urgent and dangerous, something that threatened not only the estate's finances, but potentially the very safety of the man she had come here to marry. In the days that followed, the household's fragile unity began to show new strain, though not from the discovery in the West Wing, which remained known only to Alara, Edmund, and Margaret. Instead, it came from an unexpected source, a senior member of the staff named Harriet, who had served the family since the previous Duke's time and who had grown increasingly resentful of the changes Alara's presence had brought to a household she had long considered her own domain to manage. Harriet's resentment, Alara slowly realized, was not born of malice so much as fear, an older woman's anxiety at watching decades of familiar routine reshaped by a young stranger who seemed, despite her outsider status, to be winning the loyalty of staff Harriet had spent years training and guiding herself. It came to a head one afternoon when Harriet openly challenged Alara's authority in front of several younger maids, questioning aloud whether it was proper for a lady not yet even married into the family to be involving herself so deeply in the household's private affairs. Alara, though stung by the public confrontation, chose her response carefully, refusing to meet Harriet's hostility with anger of her own. She acknowledged, calmly and without defensiveness, that she understood Harriet's years of devoted service to the family, and that she had never intended to diminish that service or the respect it deserved. She explained, honestly, that her involvement came not from a desire to seize control, but from genuine concern for a household she hoped, in time, to belong to fully, and from an awareness that the family currently faced dangers Harriet herself did not yet know the full extent of. The confrontation did not resolve entirely in that single exchange, and Harriet's wariness lingered for some days afterward, but the younger staff, who had already come to trust Alara through weeks of shared work and genuine kindness, made their own loyalties clear in small, quiet ways, continuing to seek her guidance and confide in her even as Harriet watched with visible disapproval. Slowly, even Harriet's resistance began to soften, worn down not by confrontation, but by the same patient consistency that had won over the rest of the household weeks before. It was during this same tense period that Lady Constance returned to Ashcombe Hall a second time, unannounced, her manner this time considerably more direct than her earlier visit. She arrived in the late afternoon, and Alara, forewarned by a stable boy who recognized the approaching carriage, had just enough time to compose herself and alert Edmund before their unwelcome guest was shown into the drawing room. This time, Lady Constance made no pretense of idle concern. She spoke plainly of rumors reaching her, rumors of financial trouble deepening at Ashcombe Hall, and suggested, with barely concealed satisfaction, that perhaps it would be wise for the family to consider consolidating certain assets under more capable management. Management she herself would be happy to provide given her own experience and her rightful place among the family's elder relations. Alara listened to this proposal with outward calm, though inwardly she recognized it immediately for what it was, an attempt to seize control of the estate under the guise of concerned assistance, timed precisely for a moment when the Duke himself was absent and unable to refuse. She responded carefully, thanking Lady Constance for her concern, but making clear that any decisions regarding the estate's management would wait for the Duke's own return and his personal judgment, a judgment she trusted completely regardless of whatever difficulties he currently faced. Lady Constance's composure slipped, just briefly, at this firm but polite refusal, and for a moment Alara glimpsed something colder beneath her elegant exterior, a calculating frustration at finding her plans obstructed by a mere stranger she had clearly expected to manipulate far more easily. Before departing, Lady Constance made one final remark, delivered with deceptive casualness, expressing hope that the Duke's business, whatever it truly entailed, would resolve itself soon, and that no further unfortunate incidents would befall the household in his continued absence. The words hung in the air long after her carriage had disappeared down the drive, and Alara understood them immediately not as idle courtesy, but as a veiled warning, confirmation, if any more had been needed, that Lady Constance's interest in Ashcombe Hall's troubles was neither innocent nor concluded. That night, unable to shake the unease Lady Constance's visit had left behind, Alara found herself once more unable to sleep, standing at her window watching the dark grounds below. It was there, sometime past midnight, that she first noticed the flicker of light moving near the stables, faint but unmistakable, a lantern carried by someone who had no obvious reason to be abroad at such an hour. Her heart began to race as she watched the light move deliberately toward the stable doors, and she understood, with sudden cold certainty, that whatever danger she had begun to sense gathering around Ashcombe Hall was no longer confined to letters and locked rooms and veiled threats delivered over afternoon tea. It had arrived tonight at their very doorstep. Alara did not waste time deliberating. She threw a shawl over her nightdress, grabbed the small candle from her bedside table, and hurried through the darkened corridors toward Edmund's quarters, waking him with an urgent knock that brought him to his door within moments, already alert to the tension in her voice. She explained quickly what she had seen, and together they roused two of the stronger, stable hands before making their way out into the cold night air toward the flickering light she had spotted from her window. They found the stable doors already ajar, a lantern set carelessly on a bale of hay, and a stranger crouched near the tack room, clearly searching through the stored equipment and papers kept there for the estate's horses and carriages. The man startled at their approach, dropping a bundle of documents he had been examining, and made a desperate attempt to flee past them into the darkness. But the stable hands, quick and strong, caught him before he could escape more than a few steps, wrestling him to the ground despite his struggling. Edmund held the lantern close to the stranger's face, and though none of them recognized him immediately, his fine coat and clean hands marked him clearly as no common thief looking for coin or goods to sell. Alara knelt to retrieve the scattered documents he had dropped, and her breath caught as she recognized, among them, records of the estate's tenant agreements and correspondence detailing the very financial difficulties Lady Constance had inquired about so pointedly during her visits. Under Edmund's firm questioning, the man's composure quickly crumbled, and he admitted, stammering with fear, that he had been sent by Lady Constance herself, tasked with gathering evidence of the estate's financial troubles that she intended to use, alongside other information she already possessed, to convince the wider family, and perhaps even the courts, that the Duke was no longer fit to manage Ashcombe Hall's affairs, particularly in his current unexplained absence. He claimed to know nothing of any threats sent to the Duke directly, insisting his role had been limited to this single task, but his testimony was enough to confirm what Alara and Edmund had already begun to suspect. They held the man through the remainder of the night in a locked storeroom, uncertain what authority they truly held to detain him, but unwilling to let him escape with knowledge of what he had discovered, or to alert Lady Constance that his mission had failed before they had time to decide how best to respond. Alara barely slept the rest of that night, her mind racing through the implications of what they had uncovered, understanding now that Lady Constance's ambitions extended far beyond simple opportunism. She was actively working to seize control of the estate through whatever means necessary: financial manipulation, veiled threats, and now outright trespass in pursuit of evidence to support her claims. Morning brought little relief, As Alara descended to find the household already buzzing with news of the previous night's intruder, the story having spread quickly despite her and Edmund's attempts at discretion. She addressed the staff directly rather than allow rumor to spread unchecked, explaining plainly that someone had attempted to steal sensitive estate documents, and that the household needed to remain vigilant until the matter could be properly resolved. She did not name Lady Constance directly, unwilling to make an accusation she could not yet fully prove, but she saw in the eyes of several senior staff, including, finally, even Harriet, a dawning understanding of the danger the household now faced together. It was that same afternoon that word reached Ashcombe Hall of a far greater crisis unfolding beyond its walls, one that would ultimately reveal the true depth of Alara's character to everyone who witnessed it. A messenger arrived from the nearby village, breathless and soaked from a hard ride through worsening weather, bearing news that the river running along the estate's eastern boundary had begun rising rapidly following days of heavy rain further upstream, threatening to overflow its banks and flood the low-lying tenant farms and the village itself before nightfall. The household erupted into controlled panic, Edmund immediately organizing what resources he could to warn the tenant families and begin evacuating those in the most immediate danger. But it quickly became clear that Ashcombe Hall's usual complement of staff and resources would not be enough to manage a crisis of this scale alone, particularly with the Duke absent and unable to coordinate the estate's full response. It was in this moment, with the household teetering on the edge of chaos, that Alara stepped forward and took charge in a manner that surprised even those who had already come to respect her. She organized the household with swift, clear authority, sending riders to alert every tenant farm along the river's path, directing the stable hands to prepare every available cart and horse to help transport families and belongings to higher ground, and instructing the kitchen staff to begin preparing food and blankets for those who would need shelter at the main house itself. She did not simply issue orders from a place of safety, but rode out herself into the worsening weather, joining Edmund and the tenant families in the difficult, muddy work of moving livestock and possessions away from the rising water. Throughout the long, exhausting hours that followed, Alara worked alongside villagers and staff alike, wading through ankle-deep water to help carry children and elderly tenants to safety, organizing the chaotic influx of frightened families arriving at Ashcombe Hall's doors, and personally overseeing the distribution of food and dry clothing to those who had lost nearly everything to the rising flood. She did not rest, did not retreat to the comfort of the house while others labored, and her tireless presence throughout the crisis became, by the time the rains finally began to ease near midnight, a story already spreading through every corner of the estate and the village beyond it. It was during this same chaotic night, amid the desperate work of the flood, that Alara made a discovery that would prove just as significant as anything found in the West Wing. While helping organize displaced families in the Great Hall of Ashcombe Hall, she encountered an elderly tenant farmer who, in his exhaustion and gratitude, began speaking freely of matters he might otherwise have kept carefully private. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had once worked as a groundskeeper's assistant at the estate years before, and that he vividly recalled a night, not long before Julian's death, when he had witnessed a heated argument between the young master and a well-dressed visitor near the very stables where Alara herself had confronted the intruder just the night before. Alara pressed him gently for more details, and the old man, perhaps loosened by relief at his family's safety and the long night's exhaustion, recalled that the visitor had been a woman, elegant and clearly of high standing, and that the argument had concerned money, substantial sums the young master apparently owed, and refused to repay on the terms demanded. He remembered, too, that the woman had worn fine jewelry that night, cufflinks and rings that had caught the lantern light as she gestured angrily during their heated exchange. Details that meant nothing to him at the time, but which struck Alara now with the force of confirmation she had been seeking for weeks. The pieces now fit together with terrible clarity. Julian had owed Lady Constance money, likely substantial sums borrowed against promises he could not keep, and their confrontation over this debt had occurred shortly before his death, quite possibly on the very night he fell from the West Wing gallery. Whether Lady Constance had played a direct role in his death, or whether she had simply seized upon the tragedy afterward as leverage against the grieving Duke, Alara could not yet say with certainty. But the connection between Lady Constance, the cufflink found at the scene, the threatening letter that had driven the Duke from his own home, and now this witness account of a heated confrontation over debt, formed a chain of evidence far too strong to remain simply suspicion any longer. By dawn, the flood waters had finally begun to recede, leaving behind muddy devastation across the lower farms, but, thanks to the household's swift response, no lives lost among the tenant families who called Ashcombe Hall's lands home. Exhausted, mud-streaked, and barely able to stand, Alara nonetheless found herself surrounded by grateful villagers and staff alike, many openly weeping with relief and gratitude, several approaching to thank her directly for the courage and leadership she had shown throughout the long, terrifying night. Edmund, finding her at last resting briefly against the great hall's cold stone wall, looked at her with an expression that held none of the guarded suspicion of their first meeting weeks before, only genuine, unreserved respect. He told her plainly that he had never, in all his years serving this family, witnessed anyone rise to a crisis the way she had that night. Not even, he admitted quietly, the Duke himself in his younger years before grief and duty had worn him down so heavily. Alara, too tired to feel anything but simple gratitude that the worst had passed, asked only after the fate of the man they had detained the previous night, wanting to ensure he had not been forgotten amid the chaos of the flood. Edmund confirmed he remained secured, and together they agreed that with dawn now breaking and evidence mounting steadily against Lady Constance, the time had finally come to send urgent word to the Duke himself, wherever his mysterious business had taken him, informing him not only of the flood and the household's response, but of everything they had uncovered in his absence, and the clear and present danger still threatening the family he had left behind. As the letter was prepared and dispatched with the estate's fastest rider that very morning, Alara allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a moment of quiet reflection on how completely her circumstances had transformed since that first stormy night of her arrival. She had come to Ashcombe Hall a stranger, uncertain of her welcome, uncertain even of the man she was meant to marry. Now, muddy and exhausted after a night that had tested every part of her courage and resolve, she understood that she had become something far more than a stranger within these walls. She had become, in every way that truly mattered, a part of this household's fight for its own survival, and whatever awaited her when the Duke finally returned, she would face it not as an outsider awaiting his judgment, but as someone who had already proven, beyond any doubt, exactly where her loyalties and her courage truly belonged. The Duke of Ashcombe Hall, whose name the household still spoke with careful formality even in his continued absence, was named Alastair Vane, and on the very morning that the urgent letter left Ashcombe Hall in the hands of its fastest rider, he himself was already deep in a struggle of his own, far from the estate he had left weeks before. His business away from home had never truly been business at all, not in the way his household believed. He had received the same threatening letter Alara had discovered, and rather than allow its author to expose whatever twisted version of Julian's death she intended to reveal, he had ridden out immediately to confront Lady Constance directly, hoping to resolve the matter quietly, privately, without ever involving the household he had sworn to protect. He had spent weeks tracking her movements, following rumors and correspondence through neighboring estates and finally into the capital itself, always arriving just after she had departed, always one step behind a woman who seemed to anticipate his every move. The strain of the chase, combined with the fresh reopening of grief he had spent 3 years trying to contain, had worn him down considerably, leaving him a shadow of the composed, dutiful man his household remembered. It was the estate's rider, finding him at last in a modest inn on the road back toward Ashcombe Hall, who finally brought him news of everything that had transpired in his absence. Alastair read Edmund's letter with mounting disbelief, learning of the bride who had arrived to find him gone, of the fire she had helped extinguish, of the flood she had helped the household survive, of the intruder caught in his own stables working on Lady Constance's behalf, and of the cufflink found in the very gallery where his brother had died 3 years before. By the time he finished reading, his hands were shaking, though whether from exhaustion, grief, or something closer to hope, he could not entirely say. He rode for Ashcombe Hall without further delay, pushing his horse harder than prudence allowed, arriving at the estate's gates in the late afternoon of the following day, road-worn and travel-stained, looking nothing like the composed Duke his household remembered sending away weeks before. The gates opened for him immediately, word of his approach having reached the house ahead of him, and he found the entire household gathered in the courtyard to greet him. Relief and anxiety mingled openly on every face. But it was not the familiar faces of his staff that first caught his attention as he dismounted. It was the young woman standing slightly apart from the others, her posture calm despite the visible exhaustion still lingering from the flood 2 days before, her eyes meeting his with a directness that surprised him, given everything she must have endured in his absence, and given that this was, after all, their very first meeting. He recognized her immediately, though they had never met, simply by the way the household seemed to gather naturally around her, deferring to her presence in a manner he had not witnessed even from his own most senior staff. Their first words to each other were not the formal pleasantries either might have imagined for such an occasion weeks before. Alastair, still gripping Edmund's urgent letter, asked simply, his voice rough with fatigue and barely contained emotion, whether it was true that she had entered the West Wing, that she had found evidence connecting his brother's death to Lady Constance. Alara answered honestly, without embellishment or apology, that she had, and that she had done so not out of idle curiosity, but because she had come to understand, over her weeks in his household, that protecting Ashcombe Hall required confronting even its most painful secrets rather than allowing them to remain hidden, while danger gathered unchecked around them. Something in her answer, direct and unflinching, seemed to break through the exhaustion and grief Alastair had carried for so long. He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the stranger he had expected to eventually greet with polite formality, but a woman who had, in his absence, become exactly the kind of partner Ashcombe Hall had desperately needed and never had. He thanked her, his voice barely steady, for everything the letter had described, and for everything he suspected it had not fully captured. There was little time, however, for lengthy reunion or reflection. Alastair confirmed grimly that Lady Constance's pursuit of him had not ended with his own flight from her schemes, and that she was, even now, likely aware that her plot had begun to unravel, given the failure of the man she had sent to steal estate documents and the growing evidence connecting her to Julian's final night. He warned the household that she would not simply retreat quietly, not a woman who had already shown herself willing to threaten, manipulate, and trespass in pursuit of what she believed was rightfully hers. His warning proved prophetic within hours. As evening settled over Ashcombe Hall, a rider arrived bearing word that Lady Constance herself was approaching the estate, accompanied by a small party of men whose purpose remained unclear, but whose presence suggested she intended this confrontation to end far more decisively than her previous, more subtle attempts to undermine the family's stability. Alastair, despite his exhaustion, immediately began organizing the household's defense, though defense against a woman of Lady Constance's standing meant careful strategy rather than any outright confrontation that might expose the family to further scandal. It was Alara who suggested, calmly and clearly, that rather than attempting to bar Lady Constance from the estate entirely, which would only invite further legal or public complications given her standing within the family, they should instead allow her entry and confront her directly with the evidence they had gathered, forcing her to answer for her actions before witnesses who could not later be dismissed or discredited. Alastair, weighing her suggestion carefully, recognized both its risk and its wisdom, and after brief consultation with Edmund, agreed that this direct confrontation offered the clearest path to finally ending the threat Lady Constance represented once and for all. They gathered in the great hall to await her arrival, Alistair at the center flanked by Alara and Edmund, with Margaret and several senior staff positioned as witnesses to whatever unfolded. When Lady Constance finally swept through the doors, her composed elegance faltering only slightly at the sight of the Duke, she had believed still occupied elsewhere, chasing shadows of her own making. The tension in the room crackled like the storm that had greeted Alara's own arrival weeks before. Alistair spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly still churning beneath his composed exterior, laying out plainly everything the household had uncovered in his absence. The threatening letter matching her handwriting, the cufflink recovered from the very spot where Julian had fallen, the witness account of their heated confrontation over unpaid debts shortly before his death, and the attempted theft of estate documents carried out by a man now confirmed to be acting on her direct instruction. He asked her, directly and without the careful diplomacy family relations usually demanded, to explain herself, or to finally admit the truth of what had happened 3 years before. Lady Constance's composure cracked slowly under the weight of evidence too substantial to easily dismiss, her initial denials growing increasingly desperate as Alara calmly produced the cufflink itself, holding it up for the assembled witnesses to see clearly. Finally, faced with no remaining avenue of denial, Lady Constance's carefully maintained mask slipped away entirely, replaced by something colder and more bitter, and she admitted, in a voice shaking with suppressed fury rather than remorse, that she had indeed confronted Julian that night over debts he had promised repeatedly to repay and never had, that their argument had grown heated on the gallery landing, and that in the chaos of that confrontation, Julian had stumbled backward against the railing, already weakened by drink and fallen before she could reach him. She insisted, even as the household absorbed this devastating confirmation, that his death had been a tragic accident, not an act of violence on her part, and that her subsequent silence had been born of fear rather than malice. Fear that no one would believe an accident given the substantial debts that gave her clear motive to wish him harm. But she offered no defense for the threatening letter, for the years of quiet manipulation that followed, or for her recent attempts to seize control of an estate already weakened by grief she herself had done nothing to ease and everything to exploit. The revelation settled over the great hall in heavy, stunned silence, Alistair standing motionless as he finally heard, after 3 years of unanswered questions, the true account of his brother's final moments. Alara watched him carefully, seeing grief and anger and something like relief all warring across his exhausted features, and she resisted the urge to step forward, understanding that this moment, however connected to everything she herself had uncovered, ultimately belonged to him alone. It was Edmund, finally, who broke the silence, informing Lady Constance in a voice that carried the full weight of the household's collective anger that her actions, whatever she chose to call the accident itself, constituted clear and serious wrongdoing that could no longer be quietly ignored or dismissed as family matter. Lady Constance, recognizing at last that her schemes had entirely unraveled, made one final, desperate attempt at defiance, but found herself facing not only the Duke's cold fury, but the unified resolve of an entire household that had, in his absence, learned exactly how to stand together against a threat to the family they had chosen, in every meaningful sense, to protect. Lady Constance departed Ashcombe Hall that night not as a triumphant schemer, but as a woman whose ambitions had finally collapsed entirely under the weight of her own actions, escorted from the estate under Edmund's watchful supervision, with clear warning that the family would pursue whatever legal consequences her conduct warranted, both for the threats made against the Duke and for her role, however she chose to characterize it, in the tragic events of 3 years before. The household watched her carriage disappear down the drive with a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow, understanding that whatever justice followed would not undo the grief that had shaped Ashcombe Hall for so long. In the quiet that followed her departure, Alistair remained standing in the great hall long after the other staff had dispersed to their duties, staring at nothing in particular, the weight of finally learning the truth about his brother settling over him in ways he had not fully anticipated. Alara, sensing that he needed neither comfort forced upon him nor solitude entirely, chose simply to remain nearby, close enough to offer presence without demanding conversation he was not yet ready to give. It was Alistair, eventually, who broke the silence between them, turning to look at her properly for what felt like the first time since his return, exhaustion and grief, and something gentler all mingling in his expression. He told her quietly that he had left Ashcombe Hall weeks before expecting to protect his household from a threat he intended to handle entirely alone, never imagining that the woman meant to become his wife would end up protecting that same household far more effectively than he himself had managed from a distance. He admitted, with a rawness that surprised them both, that he had spent 3 years believing himself solely responsible for guarding his family's grief and secrets, only to return and find that a stranger, arrived by arrangement rather than choice, had understood almost immediately what he himself had never been able to accept, that secrets left buried too long only grow more dangerous with time. Elara answered honestly that she had not set out to uncover his family's private sorrow, only to understand the house and people she found herself suddenly among, and that everything else had followed naturally from that simple beginning. She told him gently that she did not judge him for the years of silence, understanding grief well enough to know it rarely followed sensible paths, but that she was grateful, deeply so, that circumstance had allowed her to help protect what mattered most to him, even before they had properly met. Their conversation that night stretched long past what either might have expected from a first true meeting, moving slowly from the heavy weight of Julian's death and Lady Constance's betrayal toward gentler ground, Alistair asking, with genuine curiosity rather than mere courtesy, about Elara's own family, her own history, the person she had been before circumstance and arrangement brought her to his door. Elara found herself answering openly, surprised at how easily conversation flowed with a man she had known, in truth, for only a matter of hours, yet who already felt, through everything the household had shared of him and everything he now shared himself, far less a stranger than she had expected. In the days that followed, Ashcombe Hall began, slowly, to breathe easier than it had in 3 long years. Alistair, freed finally from the burden of unanswered questions and hidden threat, ordered the West Wing reopened, not to erase his brother's memory, but to honor it properly at last, commissioning a small memorial garden near the gallery where Julian had fallen, a place the household could visit openly rather than avoiding in careful, unspoken silence. Margaret wept openly the first time she walked through the reopened doors, though her tears, she assured Elara, were as much relief as sorrow. The household's dynamic shifted visibly in these weeks, the careful guardedness that had defined so much of Elara's early days entirely replaced by open warmth and genuine partnership. Harriet, who had once challenged Elara's place within the house so openly, became, in time, one of her most devoted supporters, admitting privately one afternoon that she had never seen a household transform so completely for the better in all her years of service, and that whatever doubts she had once harbored had been thoroughly and rightfully put to rest. Alistair and Elara, meanwhile, spent increasing time together, no longer confined to the formal obligations of an arranged match, but drawn together by something that had grown, almost without either fully noticing, into genuine affection built on the unusual foundation of crisis, courage, and shared purpose rather than traditional courtship. He walked with her often through the estate's grounds, now recovering steadily from the flood's damage, discussing plans for the tenant farms, for the estate's finances, for a future neither had imagined quite this way when their families first arranged the match months before. It was on one such walk, beneath the estate's ancient oaks now bright with the colors of deepening autumn, that Alistair finally spoke plainly of what had grown between them, admitting that he had arrived home prepared to fulfill a duty owed to family and title, expecting little beyond practical partnership from a marriage born of arrangement rather than choice. Instead, he told her, he had found himself falling for a woman who had proven, in every way that mattered, more capable, more courageous, and more deeply connected to his household and his heart than he could have ever hoped to arrange or predict. Elara, moved beyond words by his honesty, admitted in turn that she too had come to Ashcombe Hall prepared for nothing more than dutiful partnership, and had found instead a household, and a man, worth loving far beyond the terms of any arrangement. Their engagement, once a matter of practical necessity between two families, transformed in that quiet autumn moment into something neither had anticipated but both now welcomed fully. A bond built not on the empty formality of titles and land, but on trust earned through fire and flood, and shared confrontation with danger neither had chosen, but both had faced together. The wedding, when it finally took place some weeks later, bore little resemblance to the cold, formal ceremony either might have expected from an arranged match between strangers. The entire household attended, not merely as staff observing their employer's obligations, but as genuine participants celebrating a union they themselves had witnessed forming through months of shared hardship and growing trust. Margaret oversaw the preparations with evident joy. Bessie prepared a feast that stretched the kitchen's newly repaired capabilities to their fullest. And even Harriet, in a gesture that surprised everyone, presented Alara with a small, carefully preserved heirloom that had belonged to the Duke's own mother. A gift she said she had been waiting years to bestow upon a mistress worthy of receiving it. As Alara stood before the assembled household and the small gathering of family and neighbors who had come to witness the ceremony, she found herself thinking back to that first stormy night weeks before, arriving alone and uncertain at locked gates, greeted not by the man she was meant to marry, but by a suspicious steward and a house full of guarded secrets. She had come to Ashcombe Hall a stranger sent to fulfill an arrangement neither she nor its master had chosen for themselves. She left that ceremony, hand in hand with Alastair, as something far more meaningful, a woman who had earned her place not through the accident of arrangement, but through everything she had chosen to become before he had ever known her name. The household watched their new Duke and Duchess with visible pride and affection, as they exchanged their final vows beneath the same ancient oaks where their understanding had first truly deepened. And as the ceremony concluded amid genuine celebration rather than mere formal obligation, Alara understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead for Ashcombe Hall, she would face them not as an outsider bound by arrangement, but as someone who belonged, fully and completely, to the home and the family she had first entered as a stranger caught in a storm. A year had passed since Alara first arrived at Ashcombe Hall through the fury of that unforgettable storm, and the estate she now called home bore little resemblance to the quiet, grief-laden house she had entered as a stranger. The garden Sela's tended had grown fuller and more vibrant than they had been in years. The west wing stood open and bright, its rooms restored not to erase the past, but to honor it properly. And the memorial garden near the gallery had become, unexpectedly, one of the household's most beloved corners of the estate, a place where staff and family alike gathered quietly to remember Julian with warmth rather than avoidance. Lady Constance's fate had been resolved through quiet but firm legal proceedings in the months following her exposure. Her claims to any involvement in the estate's affairs permanently severed, her reputation among the wider family and county irreparably damaged by conduct too serious to be smoothed over by wealth or connection alone. She retreated from public life entirely, and Ashcombe Hall, freed at last from her shadow, continued its steady recovery under Alastair and Alara's joint stewardship. Its finances gradually strengthened through careful management neither had been forced to undertake entirely alone. Alara had grown, over that year, into a role far exceeding what either family had originally imagined when arranging her marriage. She oversaw the estate's daily affairs alongside Edmund, whose guarded formality of their first meeting had long since transformed into deep, genuine friendship and trust. She worked closely with Margaret on matters both practical and personal, the two having developed a bond that resembled family far more than mere employer and staff. And she remained, throughout every success and challenge, the same woman who had once rolled up her sleeves to fight a kitchen fire and organize a flood evacuation, never losing the humility and genuine care that had first won the household's loyalty before Alastair had even returned home. Their marriage, born from arrangement but built through fire and flood and shared confrontation with danger, had deepened steadily into something neither had dared hope for in those early uncertain days. Alistair, freed finally from the isolating burden of grief he had carried silently for 3 long years, had become, by every account of those who knew him, a lighter, warmer version of the dutiful man his household remembered, his laughter returning to Ashcombe Hall's halls in a way even the oldest staff admitted they had feared they might never hear again. It was on a quiet autumn evening, much like the one when he had first spoken plainly of his growing affection for her beneath the estate's ancient oaks, that Alistair found Alara in the small parlor Margaret had once claimed for her private use during those earliest uncertain days, a room that had become, over the year, entirely her own. He carried with him a small wrapped bundle, and when she opened it, she found within it a simple, elegant piece of jewelry, nothing like the ostentatious wealth Lady Constance had once flaunted, but a modest, carefully chosen gift that had belonged, he explained gently, to his own mother, passed down now not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to see it carried forward by a woman who had earned every bit of the family's trust and love. Alara accepted the gift with quiet emotion, understanding its significance far beyond its material value, a symbol of everything that had grown between them since that stormy first night when she had arrived expecting only a marriage of convenience and found, instead, an entire household and a man worth genuinely loving. She thought often, in quiet moments like this one, of the frightened young woman who had stood before locked gates in the pouring rain, uncertain of her welcome, uncertain even of the stranger she had been sent to marry, and she felt, looking now at the life she had built at Ashcombe Hall, a deep and abiding gratitude for every difficult, frightening step that had led her here. The household, too, had settled into a new rhythm entirely, one built on genuine warmth rather than the cautious formality that had once defined its relationship with any outsider arriving to claim the title of mistress. New staff joining Ashcombe Hall in the months, since the wedding often remarked, with some surprise, at how openly the older servants spoke of their Duchess, sharing stories of the fire she had fought, and the flood she had helped the estate survive with obvious pride rather than mere dutiful respect, tales that had already begun to take on the shape of local legend among the tenant families who had witnessed her courage firsthand. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the anniversary of that first fateful storm, Alara found herself standing at the very same window where she had once watched the dark shape of the closed west wing against the night sky, uncertain of everything that lay ahead. Now, looking out at grounds bright with lantern light and a household long since made whole again, she felt none of that early uncertainty, only a settled, quiet joy at everything that had grown from such an unlikely and difficult beginning. Alistair joined her at the window as the first snow of the season began drifting down over Ashcombe Hall's grounds, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched together in comfortable silence. He told her softly that he sometimes still marveled at the strange fortune that had sent his household's letter announcing her arrival, just days before circumstances beyond either their control had driven him away, leaving her to arrive not to a warm welcome from the man she was meant to marry, but to an empty house and a wary staff who knew nothing yet of the woman who would soon become the heart of their home. Alara, leaning into his embrace, answered simply that she had never once regretted those difficult early days, understanding now, with the clarity only distance and time could provide, that everything she had endured and overcome in his absence had shaped her into exactly the partner Ashcombe Hall and Alistair himself had truly needed. Their story had not begun with courtship or romance in any traditional sense, but with a storm, a locked gate, and a household forced to meet her long before its master ever could. Yet from that unlikely beginning had grown something far stronger and more enduring than either family could have arranged or predicted, a partnership built not on the empty formality of titles and land, but on courage, honesty, and a love that had proven itself, time and again, through every trial that circumstance had placed before them. As the snow continued to fall softly over the estate that had once felt so cold and unfamiliar to her, Alara understood, with complete and settled certainty, that she had found not merely a title or a marriage through the arrangement that had first brought her to Ashcombe Hall's gates, but a true home, a genuine family, and a love that had been earned, step by difficult step, long before the man she had come to marry ever knew her name.